Hello, this is Stephen Nojiri, and this is another Tada Genji tradition video. In this video, we're going to briefly discuss the following. Samurai camping. So a brief look at some of the basics of samurai camping. Now, understand we're not talking about war party camps, not these large camps of many samurai, but these are small groups of samurai camping to avoid detection and to avoid gathering the attention of larger groups. In the particular text that we're pulling from, there's a series of when groups of samurai are traveling, large groups, medium groups, small groups, and it talks about like setting up large war camps, or even as you go from large to medium to small, you look at large war camps to smaller camps to these sort of almost like woodland camps, like tents, going camping in small groups kind of thing. And then there's an entire section where it discusses sort of the pros and cons of staying at the like local inns versus needing these sort of almost stealth camps out in the woods. The difference, it ultimately is about when you need to avoid detection. So these camps are for small groups of samurai who are on special missions, who need to move about without being detected. It's like stealth operations, if you will. So, but the same principles of these smaller stealth operations can be multiplied into larger groups. So it's not perfectly for stealth camping. It's what it is it's small, like very small groups camping in the woods, etc., etc. So it doesn't necessarily have anything to do directly with any kind of stealth, espionage, tactical mission, but it's the concept is small group samurai camping. And then we're also going to look at the Sagio cord, and it has a connection to this as well. And then we're going to look at camp curtains or war curtains. So again, um, Genji perspective on these curtains and aspects related to the curtains. So what we're really looking at here is a small camp, and we're going to look at the camp itself, some aspects of that. We're going to take a moment to look at Sagio cord and see how does that relate, and then we're going to look at war curtains and see how those relate as well. So these three things will come together to hopefully give you a decent idea about what a Tada Genji small camp would look like. And this by no means exhausts the topic. Everything we're talking about is related to Genji tradition, and this by no means is the final say on samurai tradition, because this is only a Genji tradition, and we're not even going to go into every aspect, just these three parts. So if you'll take a look at the screen, we'll begin with this picture and recognizing a few important details. So in the picture you can see two bushi sitting there in this structure. And this structure is one of the examples, one of the main examples of the type of tent, for lack of a better word, or structure for one of these small camps. And it gives you an idea of this sort of samurai tent. It's not like a modern tent. Now, it is very similar to a lean-to. If you're familiar with what a lean-to is, it's very similar to that. Um, in some regards, for me personally, I also find it very similar to kind of the structure of the nipi or the wigwam kind of structure, where in terms of the overall structure. Of course, the difference being it doesn't have a it's not a it's not a doorway. It's the front is entirely open. So lean-to is probably the best comparison. If you're familiar with what a lean-to is, then you're sort of in the right ballpark. The basic concept is you have an open front, and then it sort of tapers as it goes backwards from the entrance. So a big open entrance, and then it tapers as it goes. So again, this is by no means the only type of samurai tent, but this is the sort of this is the Genji simplest tent. So The tents can get more complicated than this, but if you're a small, very small group of Genji tradition samurai and you need to sort of like camp in the woods to avoid detection, this is kind of the standard tent for that. The other thing that we need to take a moment to look at is in the Tada Genji tradition. Again, we're only focusing on the Genji tradition. The fire is placed at the bottom of a hole, so you don't just make a fire that is above ground, above the ground or on ground. You actually dig a hole in the ground and the fire goes down into the hole. So this somewhat hides the light of the fire. Now there's a little bit more detail in terms of how to deal with smoke, and there's variations of this, but in the most basic form you want to actually put the fire down in the hole, and this keeps the sort of the light of the of the flames of the fire from being visible all around. You can still see, when you're close enough to the camp, of course, you can still see the light of the fire, but you have to basically be really close to the camp. This prevents people from a distance being able to see the campfire. Um, and in these smaller camps, you have the fire that's for heating, for heat, and for cooking, but you also have watch fires. And we won't go into that too much, but it's a very common samurai thing to have watch fires. Now, those watch fires are also meant to be kept lower to the ground or in the ground, again, to maintain some level of stealth. So if you're not trying to be stealthy, obviously the watchfires are going to be above ground, right? But in this particular case, even the watchfires need to be in the ground. So now if you look at the picture, we're beginning to build this sort of image up. You can see the two bushi in the special type of tent, and then they've got their heating and cooking fire dug out in front of them. It could also potentially even be in the tent, the ground of the tent, but um, that could be that way, could not be. So for the purpose of the images, we're going to say that these bushi have decided to have their fire outside the tent. So you have the tent and then you have the fire out in front, and then as you can see, you have the watch fires as well. Again, those watch fires would generally be in the ground. So all of these sort of fires are there, but again, they're taking precautions so that it's not so easily seeable by other people. Now, on the image, you'll also see where I've provided some of the kanji. Now, the kanji taken from the text, but it's just to give you an idea. Like this type of tent it has a name, but for purpose of ease for reference, it is oftentimes referred to just by this one kanji in this particular text. Now that kanji by itself just means the trunk or the torso of the body or the hull of a ship or the frame of a drum. That's the sort of standard definition of that kanji is framework, trunk, hull of a ship, frame of a drum. But in the text, it's referring to the structure of the tent itself, or it's also in a way referring to the tent directly as itself. So, I mean, technically it is referring to the structure of the tent, but again, that gets used as a reference for the tent itself. Um, and then you'll see another kanji down there, which refers also to the wooden frame. But interestingly enough, this kanji can also be used for yagura, which is a watchtower, or a weapon, or that kanji can also be used for a weapon storehouse. So it's interesting because some of the kanji used have double meanings. But I've decided to go ahead and show them to you to give you an idea that these again are kanji that are used to describe either the tent itself or the structure or the framework of the tent, but they have these other meanings which kind of also go along with the structure itself. So I find it interesting. Here we're looking at some of the what we're going to do now is we're going to look at some of the tools, some of the things that samurai uses. So these items are similar to ashigaru pieces, and this is due to that need for the mobility and the need for stealth. So while these may look like very ashigaru pieces, these are actually even being worn by the samurai or the bushi, proper bushi, in these particular cases, such as a simple headgear, right? So we've talked about, a fully armored samurai with his kabuto with all of its different decorations and meanings and parts. But in this particular case, this is just either a well padded armored hood. So it's not a proper kabuto. It's a sort of like it's a hood, and then depending on the level, it can either be, padded, reinforced, have some kind of armor added to it, etc., etc., etc. But it's a weaponized hood or an armored hood, not a kabuto. And the same thing goes for the haramaki, which is the chest armor, and then the chest gear, or the chest gear, the arms, the legs. We're not looking at full on proper samurai armor. We're looking at reduced armor. We're looking at, it's either incredibly thick reinforced fabric, cloth, or it is, maybe it has some kind of metal plating or some kind of metal reinforcement. But again, it's not your typical samurai armor. Let's also take a moment to look at some camping items. These three items are, and there's a typo here, so I apologize. The mountain knife is mountain. It's I've I've misspelled it on the chart. My apologies, but it's mountain knife. So cooking utensils, right? It's really easy to overlook the importance of cooking ware, but if you're going to be camping, you're going to need to be able to cook and work on things. You need your utensils. So here I've decided to include this picture of this ladle. But these things are important. So often we think about, samurai with their weapons, but they have to have this kind of day-to-day gear as well. So also you see the mountain knife. It's like a hybrid between a big butcher knife and a machete, but it's actually a type of hatchet that was used in old Japan. It used like a hatchet, but it looks like a machete butcher knife hybrid. But that's also a Genji, a samurai needs that to do this sort of camping. And water containers, literally, like water bottles, right? You need to stay hydrated. A lot of times we don't think about the samurai and this, but you can be the toughest samurai ever, but you need to stay hydrated. So there is a teaching. I mean, it's a big deal, to samurai. Don't forget your water. You need to drink. You need to stay hydrated. So there's an entire teaching about water containers. And since we talked about gear and utensils, let's talk about weapons, for example. So as you know from other videos in on this channel, the Tada Genji tradition emphasizes archery, even through the age of firearms. So naturally, you're expected to have your bows and arrows and your quiver with you. So I threw a picture of one of the quivers on here. But obviously, you're going to have your bow and arrow, and your bow, your arrow, your quiver, etc., etc. And you're also, of course, expected to take your long and short sword. But remember, in the Tada Genji tradition, that does not have to mean, uchigatana and a wakizashi, right? The typical daisho. So many people believe that the big sword and the short sword has to be an uchigatana and a wakizashi, and that's not what the Tada Genji tradition teaches. So it just means that it's any combination of a large blade and a smaller blade. So it could be an uchigatana and a wakizashi. It could also be an uchigatana and a gogatana, right? Something like it's a smaller bladed katana. So or it could be a wakizashi and a tanto. It could even be a tachi and an uchigatana. The whole point is that you have one large one and one small one. That's the only real qualifier to be the large small set. Let's also take a moment to look at footwear. So let's look at the ashinaka, which means foot, middle. That's what the kanji is, ashinaka, right? So what is the ashinaka? The ashinaka is a grass sandal that only covers the front half of the foot. The ashinaka, based on these Genji documents and many other samurai documents, appears to be the most used type of grass sandal among the samurai. Now I know that most people are used to seeing, shinobi and samurai and everybody running around wearing the full grass sandals over their feet. But here is something that is true. Like, here's the reality. Most of the documentation discusses samurai and ninja and everybody who's a warrior, a bushi, wearing the half sandal, the Ashinaka. And the Genji tradition is very specific about wearing the half-foot sandal. Now, the Genji tradition also speaks of planning to have enough sandals to travel 1,000 ri, right? Which is, you can equate that in your mind to 1,000 miles. It's not exactly that, but for all purposes, you need to plan to be able to travel essentially 1,000 miles, which means that you're going to need to not only head out with many pairs of grass sandals, but you're going to need to either create, make more yourself, or purchase more, or acquire more somehow. So the this the idea of always keeping your footwear going, always having to re-up on sandals, is a reality of samurai life. And the interesting thing, the samurai, so you hang your ashinaka on the scabbard of your sword. So in reality, you would see samurai with their swords, and they would have a couple of pairs of ashinakas tied to the scabbard of their sword. That's what you would actually see. It's also interesting to consider too, because the difference between walking heel toe versus toe heel, different places of the planet, walking toe heel is the sort of the traditional way. The old Japanese way of walking is toe heel. The old Native American way of walking, multiple tribes, right? The indigenous way of the Americas is toe heel. The idea of walking heel toe is considered a European way of walking, for lack of a better word. And the fact that the ashinaka covers the front half of the foot also suggests a pattern of walking toe heel, or even walking crouched over, running in ways that you don't really, the heel doesn't touch the ground nearly as much as the toes and the front of the foot touch the ground. All right, so now that we've discussed those aspects, let's move on to the Sageo. Okay. The There are many misunderstandings in modern times about the Sageo, and most of it is kind of modern mumbo jumbo with over ritualized concepts leading to just these complicated errors. If you don't know what the Sageo is, it's the cord that goes around the scabbard of the sword. All right. So let's cut to the chase. The Genji tradition does not view the Sageo as anything sacred or ceremonial. It's just rope or cord attached to your sword. Right? The end. The primary function of the Sageo, the first and foremost function, is to be able to tie the Sageo to your belt. But many traditions, but here we're talking specifically about the Genji samurai can use the Sageo for anything that they would need rope or cord for. And so this is where it ties into the campsite. You can take the Sageo of your cord, and you can take it off your scabbard, and you can use it as rope for the campsite. That is expected of you. So I know a lot of people who practice, a lot of modern day sword stuff might cringe and shiver at the idea of using their Sageo, taking it off the sword and using it to hang things up or whatever, but that is actually what it's there for. It's not there to be any kind of ritualistic piece of anything. It's meant to be a bit of rope attached to your sword scabbard so that when you need a bit of rope, you have it available to you. The idea of keeping your Sageo cord beautifully knotted on the sword means that you're not using it correctly. A proper Genji Sageo should simply just be wrapped around the scabbard. So from the Genji perspective, if your Sageo is beautifully knotted, it means you're not using that. You're not using it, So if you're using it, you literally just wrap it around the scabbard, and that's how it's supposed to actually look. Now let's continue on with this, because you have multiple types of Sageo and multiple traditions of Sageo. For example, you have something called the Kamakura Sagio, and that's a shorter Sageo that's only about 5 shaku long, which in modern terms, give or take 5 feet. Now that's not 5 feet folded on, doubled. That's just 5 feet total, from one end to the true end of the other, not folded in any way, from one end to the other in 5 feet, 5 shaku, give or take, right? That's that's a short sagio by modern day standards, right? So that kind of sagio, the Kamakura Sagio, is really only used to tie it to your belt, and that's how you're supposed to use the Kamakura Sagio. So the Kamakura Sagio is a type of Sagio tradition that goes back to the Kamakura Shogunate. It goes back when the there was even still transitioning from tachi to uchigatana, right? Like the tachi at this point in time, the tachi was the long sword and the uchigatana was the short sword, right? So the sageo was really just meant to tie the sword to you, right, to your belt, to your waist, to your whatever. So it was a short cord, a short sageo at that point. But as time went on, as people became more and more using of the uchigatana, and the use of the uchigatana sort of supplanted the use of a tachi, the tachi sort of not went away, but became less common, and the uchigatana became more common. Then this is when the sageo length increases. When people decided that the sageo, rather than just being a tie, a tie for this, could literally just become at that point a multi-use tool. At that point, the concept was, yeah, it's a bit of rope that you keep on your saga. Just like you hang your sandals on your sword, you wrap a bit of rope around the scabbard, and that's the sagio. So, for example, you see this among the Hatakeyama retainers. So there's a sort of tradition among retainers of the Hatakeyama in the 1400s and onwards, where this type of sagio is used when the cord is it's for non-fencing related purposes or non-sword fighting purposes, right? So you're not using it to tie it to your body. It literally is a piece of rope that you're tying around your scabbard the same way that you tie your sandals around your scabbard. Okay, so at this point, the sagio can be used for camping, climbing, tying things off, tying up enemies, tying up criminals. Whatever you need rope for, it's there. So that's how that's how it interacts with the camping. You wear your sandals on your scabbard and you put a bit of rope on your scabbard. That's your sagio. Some of you are also aware that in Kusunoki-ryu and one of its sort of descendant traditions, the Fukushima-ryu, they use the sageo as part of a technique to help climb over barricades and walls and fences. Again, this technique is known from Kusunoki-ryu, from Fukushima-ryu, and from Natori-ryu. The idea, and all of those are ultimately Kusunoki traditions. The idea is that you use the sword as a step, and then you like as a step ladder almost, and then you hold one end of the rope is around your sword, and there's a special way that you actually are supposed to use it. I won't go into that, but there's a special way that you're actually supposed to tie it to your sword, and then you hold the other end, and then you step on it to get some, and then you go over the wall, and then you use the sageo to pull the sword back to you. Again, there's a special way to actually tie it when you do this. But this is sageo not as a ritualistic thing, but this is sageo used in the line of duty. Okay, next, now let's look at the war camp curtains, or the war curtains, or the camp curtains. Now, these are a very interesting part of samurai camps, samurai sort of fortifications that are pretty much overlooked and forgotten in modern times. They serve many purposes, and there's a lot of ritualism associated with them. But for this video, we're going to simply look at a few main points. So first off, let us understand that the curtains belong to the Yang castle or the Yang fort category. Now, I have made a video on castles and forts in which I discuss Yang forts and Yin forts. You should go watch that video for a better understanding, but in summation, Yang fort is an invading fort and a Yin fort is a defensive fort. And these curtains are part of the Yang, or the invading fort. You would not, if they're used for invading or pushing into enemy territory, you would not use these war curtains as any part of a defensive measure. They're just cloth, right? So when you have a small group of samurai pushing into a territory that don't, especially if they don't want to be seen, or they want say they're scouts, let's say that these are some samurai scouts, they're not going to set up a proper fort. They're going to set up a woodland camp, and they're going to use these curtains because it's a Yang technique. Right? So that's the key thing to take away. These curtains are part of Yang invasion. They're not really in any way for defense. Now that doesn't mean there may not be some war curtains in a defensive fort, but in the main, the majority of the time, these war curtains are for invading an enemy territory. So now if you look at your screen, you'll see one example of some war curtains. So let's go over a couple of basic facts. You have Yang curtains, and they have 28 loops. You have Yin curtains. They have 36 loops. The Yang and I said Yang and Yin. Sorry, that's a typo. The Yin and Yang also, whether the curtain's a Yin curtain or Yang curtain, the shape and the type of rod used to hold them up also is different. So what? So you should understand that symbolically, from the ritual symbolism, there's already like a big deal placed on whether it's yin or yang. And also, number 4, the loops have different esoteric marks, different seals on them. And they're also tied based on yin and yang, or, female and male. So the seals that are on them are different based on yin and yang, and the way they're tied is different based on yin and yang. So there's a very Omyodo Taoist sort of foundation to how these curtains are put up. They have 5 horizontal panels, as you can see in the picture. 5 panels, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And there are either 7 or 9 viewing holes. Now, in this picture, there's 7 viewing holes. And the viewing holes are almost always referred to as monomi. Now you may say, monomi, that means scout. Well, yes, monomi means patrol, it means scout, but in this particular instance, monomi means these viewing holes. Now, the top 2 holes, the top 2 monomi on a curtain are always referred to as the sun and the moon, and the rest of the viewing holes are referred to as the Big Dipper. So do you remember with the Jingunden, the sun, the moon, and the Big Dipper? It's appearing here as well. The sun and the moon viewing hole, and then the Big Dipper viewing holes. Now, if there's only 7 holes, all the holes are still referred to as the Big Dipper, even though the top 2 are still referred to the sun and the moon. If you have 9 holes, then the top 2 are the sun and the moon, and then the rest of the 7 are the Big Dipper. But the point is whether it's 7 holes with 2 overlapping or it's 9 holes, regardless, it's the sun, the moon, and the Big Dipper. And I'm not going to go into details for this because I feel it's a little too esoteric for just a general video on YouTube, so to speak. But also I'm trying to keep the video short. So I know it's already long, but trying to keep it shorter. So here we go. I'm just going to show the pictures. You can see the above is the knot pattern and the seal pattern for the male version. So you see the knot goes one direction, and the seals, you see the seal of Seimei, the seal of Domon, etc., etc., etc. There's another kanji seal. And then for the female version, it's tied a different way, and then you see these different sort of seals on them. So there are extensive, well, not super extensive, but there are teachings about, which seal goes on which side, and then, which, once you tie it, which seal faces inward, which seal faces outward. There's teachings for that. You don't just arbitrarily put the seals on there and tie it. The seals go in specific locations, and you have to knot it a certain way, and then when you're done, the knot faces a certain direction, and certain seals face certain directions. So if you want to do it properly, you have to learn these instructions. Okay, so let's try to put all of this together into a generic mental image. Now, this is not it's not per se like a fully accurate image, but we're trying to go for a generic conceptual image, a generic model. So here we go. You will see that there are there's 2 tents, and each one of those tents have some samurai in them, and then there's some fire pits dug in the ground, and now you see there are these warrior curtains surrounding where the people are camped, and you see these outer watchfires. Now, here's the thing. Again, the outer watchfires may be used, they may not be used. It's kind of up to the samurai to determine if they think that it's tactically advantageous to have guards and some in the ground watchfires on the outside of the curtains. If they're going to have guards posted out there with the watchfires, fine. But if they're not, if there's not enough of them to do that, then you're not going to have fires outside of the curtains. So those fires may or may not be there based on how it's being guarded. And also in a similar case like this, these war curtains are going to be a dark color, or specifically even just black, as the text actually say dark colors, or sometimes just flat out black war curtains, to hide and blend into the area. And so now let's simplify that some to back to just a really small group of samurai. So in closing, we've got this kind of last little bit here where the most direct, simple, basic version is that you have a small group of samurai. In this case, these two guys, right? There's these two scouts or these two shinobi, whatever. These two are in enemy territory and they're moving about, seeking, trying to avoid detection. So they've got this special kind of Genji tent that they've made, and they have the fire pit. And again, the fire pit could even be inside the tent. So in that case, the tent is built around the fire pit, so you have the main side, the opening is hidden or covered by the war curtain. So kind of like in the picture, if you can imagine that in 3D, you would have the tent and the opening of the tent, and then this war curtain is positioned so that it blocks, a direct line of sight into the opening of the tent. And then the fire may be outside or the fire might be inside. And that is a very rough, basic, but pretty decent look at this sort of Tada Genji small group of samurai camping. And that is it for this video. As always, these videos are meant to be brief, and they are meant to inspire you or to give you a starting off point. The material in this video is copywritten by me, so please do not steal this material. Please do not take it. Please do not copy it. Again, I hope it inspires you. I hope that it sets you off on your own investigations and explorations, but please be respectful.